Hi, this is James Cook of the University of Maine at Augusta, and I'm recording this video to show you how to very simply uh, obtain some information that is not simple regarding the racial composition of your town in the United States or almost any town in the United States. It's a simple technical process, but what you're actually obtaining is something that reflects a lot of complexity. So one level of complexity comes from the problem of what it means for any person to go to a town or to live in a town and perceive the makeup of that town in terms of race. A couple of issues arise immediately. One is that we do not have super powerful vision to be able to see everybody in a town all at once. So instead, what you see is a small little area of that town, and it's not representative of the whole town. The people that you will tend to see are based on where you go, what you do, and who you know. And each of those elements is characterized by either racial segregation, uh, of your organizations, of the places you go, or racial segregation of your social network, which is called homophily, the tendency for social ties to occur disproportionately to people who are like you. So if I just ask you to think about what the racial composition of your town is, given the fact that homophily exists, you will tend to, on average, estimate the proportion of people who are like you to be higher than it actually possibly is. So that's one complication. Another complication is the idea of what race actually is. The idea of race in our culture is this notion that there are these uh, perfectly traceable lineages of people who originate from different parts of the globe, have different genetics, have different biologies, and this is just something that simply is. But one of the things that biologists have demonstrated is that there's a huge overlap in genetics from different places on the globe, number one. Number two, uh, that our perception of appearances is amazingly poor in terms of uh, how we think about the actual idea of lineages. And number three, that it is um, something that we can't separate from culture. That particularly if we want to think about the idea of racialization, that the races and ethnicities that are reflected in the United States Census Bureau's categories for races and ethnicities, first of all, are not mutually exclusive. They overlap. Second, they have a lot of problems with the idea of people who have many heritages. And third, what they really reflect are a series of social conflicts between groups of people who are in competition for scarce resources over time. Old fights. And these old fights lead to racialization, the idea of the cultural creation of the idea of races, because when human beings interact with and conflict with one another, it's a whole lot easier to do violent things or oppressive things to other people when you think of them as not you, as not human, as somewhat less than who you are in your racial category. So the United States Census Bureau, which we're going to look at today, in order to get your idea of the racial composition of your town is actually encoding the United States government's official conceptualization of meaningful past conflicts in the United States. And to think about the racial composition of your town, what you're actually looking at is not biology, but you're looking at the traces of past conflict as they then come together in your town. Uh, so if you want to learn more about this, go to your nearest search engine and look at the shifting U.S. Census Bureau conceptualization of race over time. And you'll find that set of races, official races in the United States, is not what it was 20 years ago. It's not what it was 100 years ago, and it's not what it'll be 20 years from now or 100 years from now, because races are this sociocultural set of ideas about conflicts that have been happening, conflicts that are relevant, and differences in power and resources that continue to be relevant. They emerge, they disappear over time, and they reflect that conflict. So wouldn't it be interesting to take a look at your town, not from your own individual biased perception, but to be able to look at it from a bird's eye view, and then to think about how that is related to our nation's history of sets of people moving from place to place or being moved from place to place, coming into conflict with one another because they have different access to resources that everyone is trying to obtain, and thinking about how that affects the history of your town and the present situation of your town. Okay, so let's get to it. How could you do that? Well, the United States Census Bureau has a table that summarizes all that for you. It is table B02001 from the American Community Survey, which is an annual survey that involves hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people being surveyed in big cities and small towns across the United States, and they ask them questions. They ask them questions about income. They ask them questions about the kind of place they live, like the house, literally. They ask them questions about asking them to self-report. What is your racial ethnic category? Okay, this hodgepodge of categories, some of which seem to have to do with ideas of color, other ones have to do with issues of language, other ones have to do with issues of geography, of past heritage. Others have to do with this idea of who was where first. It's all jumbled together because it's not a rational system. It's a cultural system tracing past conflict. Let's look at it. So if you go to the website data.census.gov, which you can see here, you'll see a search bar. And you could simply type in the name of this table, B02001, and there it appears. And then let's select it and move forward. Okay, so what you have here is a picture of the United States overall. Now, it's got a total population, right? And so you could calculate for any one of these rows the percentage, the share of each category, right? So you could divide 236,475,401 into 328,239,523. You could get a percentage. Super. By the way, when is that for? Look up at the top and it'll tell you product. 2019 American Community Survey, ACS, 1 year estimates based on this annual exercise of workers for the American Community Survey, applied sociologists, going out and asking this question to people in towns across the United States. You'll also notice that there's a drop-down bar here, so you could head back in time for a certain number of years. Okay. And then there's a whole bunch of other options here. So let's look at this one called geos, because that's really the interesting one that I would like us to be able to look at today. So this leads to a pop-up bar, and we can head through. And what I'm looking for is place. Now, let's say I wanted to find a town that I'd lived in. I grew up for part of my life in a town called Hilton, New York. So I'm going to select New York within state. And now look at what's going on here. It then gives me a set of cities and towns, right? But if you look at them, there's Albany, Buffalo, New Rochelle, which is in Westchester County, I believe, New York City, Rochester, Schenectady, Syracuse. It's only the big ones. Why is that? It's because of the product we're looking at, which is 2019 American Community Survey 1-year estimates. I said there are hundreds of thousands of people that they survey, which is great. But the problem is that if you only look at that 1 year, there's not enough people, even though they're surveying hundreds of thousands of people and the American Community Survey every year, to actually get a detailed view of these very small towns, because a very small town is a very small share of that. And so they might get just one person or two people or three people, and that's not good for making generalizations. So how do we fix this? Well, let's go look at our product. I'm going to close this geographies option here on the lower right, and I'm going to select a new product, data product. It's a free product, by the way. You don't have to pay for this. And I'm going to look at 5-year estimates. What they do is they take 2019, which, as I'm recording this in 2021, is the last year of data that's available, because in 2020 we had a massive pandemic that disrupted this huge effort of collecting data. And so we have a missing year of data right now. 2019 is the last year we can work with. Don't worry, we'll be able to get maybe some 2021 or maybe 2022 data when this pandemic ends. But I'm going to select the 5-year estimates. And what that is it's data from 2019, 18, 17, 16, and 15, the 5 most recent years, all lumped together, because you get 5 times the statistical power that way, because you get 5 times the number of cases. And when that happens, unless you're talking about a really, really, really small town, like I'm talking about the Forks in Maine, which is this, it's a crossroads with a trading post and hardly anyone else. Those places are not going to show up. But really surprisingly small towns will show up, and the statisticians and applied sociologists in the American Community Survey have the ability to determine that the numbers of people that they've gathered information for leads them to be able to give you a pretty good estimate about the racial ethnic makeup of that town. So I'm going to select that. 5-year estimates. Okay, and now it's thinking about it, and it says, okay, you want the 5-year estimates. Well, for the United States as a whole, it's looking pretty much the same, because things don't change that quickly over time unless we have really unusual times. Now I'm going to go back to geos, and I'm going to start again, and I'm going to be looking at place, and let me come up with one of the towns I grew up in, New York. And now look in New York at all the places that are available. Adams Center, really tiny place. I'm looking for some place called Hilton. And it just keeps going and going, and then I can load the bees. Pardon my dogs, it's a pandemic year. Cazenovia of Cazenovia College, and I could just keep scrolling, or I could click here and I could just type in Hilton. Hilton Village, which is in Parma Town, which is in Monroe County, which is in the state of New York. And now I've selected it, and then I'm going to hit close and look at what happens. Okay, so now I've got, for the same racial ethnic categories here, this idea of whiteness, Black or African American alone. This is created by the Census Bureau, right? So we've got color, we've got American Indian and Alaska Native American Indian. Indian is applied description applied by Europeans. Asian alone, notice it's not Asian American, which is interesting. While we have African American up here, it's why? It's because it's cultural. It doesn't have to make sense. It represents the nonsense of conflict and the names that we give people. Okay, so I've got these numbers here, and what they show is this set of counts for this fairly small town that I grew up in which it's a very strongly white racial composition. Why? Hilton, New York is what's called an exurb. It's not a suburb that's right next to Rochester, New York, but it's an exurb. So here's the central city, here's the suburbs around it, and then there's this other set of towns called an exurb. When I grew up in it, it was an orchard town. Orchards and cows and cherries and other things like that. But also a bunch of people who wanted to be able to work in the city. It's about a 20-30 minute commute, depending on the day. But they didn't want to have to live there. And who were the people who didn't want to have to live there? Well, there was this thing that happened because of social conflict in the 20th century called white flight. So here we are in a community that is has got a lot of white people, very few Black or African American people, no people who are indicating that they are Asian or American Indian or Alaska Native or Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, right? Some people who are indicating that they have some other race that the United States Census Bureau, as a representative of the United States government, which is itself a representation of cultural thinking about what races are, reflecting past conflict, they don't fit within the United States government's conceptualization. And a small set of those who are saying, "Hang on, I've got a heritage that doesn't fit in any one box, but might fit in more than one." Okay, what can I do with this? I can download this information. You notice there's an Excel button here. Everyone at the University of Maine at Augusta has access to Microsoft Office suite of programs, which includes Microsoft Excel. And you can get it for free. Get in touch with me if you want to know how. If you use another spreadsheet, such as the free Google Suite, or OpenOffice, there's a large number of them, LibreOffice. You can export to CSV, which is a file that any spreadsheet program can read. I'm going to export to Excel because I have it. What's that going to do? It's going to create this pop-up box for me that then allows me to open it in Microsoft Excel. Once I open up Excel, and that information is getting loaded, which will take me just a moment, I can use the powers of this lovely program to calculate things like percentages, which are fairly simple. I'm going to insert a column here just so I can put it right next to the estimate. I have this total here. And in Hilton, New York, for the years of 1918, 17, 16, and 15, the American Community Survey indicates that there are a total of 5,832 people. So if I take the value of B4 I'm putting in equals because I'm doing a calculation, equals B4, whatever that value is to the left. I want to divide it by 5,832. And then I want to do the same for each of those other categories. And then finally, I'm going to tell Excel, it's giving me a proportion, which is a number between 0 and 1. If you multiply it by 100, you would get a percentage. So I could do that as well. I could go back to this cell and I could type in putting B4 divided by 5,832 in parentheses so that it knows to do that first, and then multiply it, star means multiplication, by 100. And it will give me a percentage. And now I have a notion of the percentage distribution of individuals who, to the Census Bureau, categorize themselves in the categories of race, which are these reflections of these artifacts of social conflict and division. I can find out from a bird's eye view, even though I haven't been back to Hilton, New York for over a quarter of a century. I can figure out what the racial ethnic composition of the town is from a bird's eye view, as if I could freeze everybody for a moment and just look at that distribution. And we could see what they say to the United States Census Bureau without disrupting the privacy of any one individual human being. Number one, which is important because this is an aggregate. It's estimated from surveys. The margin of error tells us the reasonable limits within which we might expect this to occur. And it's telling me about how this village compares to, if I head back to the United States Census Bureau, and I wanted to clear geographies by hitting the Geo button and then clicking clear geographies, I could select another town in New York State, perhaps Rochester, New York, or perhaps I could look at the United States overall, and I could think about the racial ethnic makeup of the United States as a whole and compare it to Hilton, and think about how this separation of people into different places and different towns happens. This is where history comes in. We can find out why certain towns have certain experiences, why people who report to the US Census Bureau that they belong to a particular race, a particular cultural understanding of history of American conflict exist in some places and not others, why they mix in some places and don't mix in others. And you have the ability to start seeing your history of the places you've lived in with a little bit more of a broad lens than that perspective of just being in your body behind your eyes would limit you to otherwise. That's what sociology can do. That's what the applied sociological work of the United States Census Bureau can do for you, at least for the United States. And it's important for us to think about when we engage in an exercise like this exactly what we're looking at. Again, not biology, but the accumulated debris of a history of intergroup conflict. I hope this has been helpful to you. If you're interested in carrying this out for your town, this is how you might do it. How you interpret it is going to be profoundly caught up in the conflict and history of conflict that has occurred in the United States, not only since its founding, but from before its founding.